Hello and welcome everyone to another lovely Saturday webinar. It is absolutely boiling hot where I am today. If it were not for this webinar, I would definitely not be wearing such a formal shirt. How is it where you are, Simone? How are you doing?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's much better. I was saying it's equally as hot where I am, and I too would probably not be in this dress. Something sleeveless.
So there you go. You're all very lucky today to have us so appropriately dressed. No swimming shorts, no bikinis. And I'm suddenly very conscious, no air conditioning. So we're going to be looking ahead today to a much colder time of the year, the end of November, beginning of December, when it is that interviews at Oxford and Cambridge will be taking place. We are hopeful that a lot of you are going to find yourselves in that position when that time comes around, that you are, getting your applications together at the moment. And while the interviews are a long way off, it's also important to make sure that you're preparing ahead of time because they are, after all, the decisive factor. So today we're going to be talking, as I've said, a little bit about the interviews, what the interview is like, what the kind of criteria you will be assessed on are, and in the event that these, as currently planned, these interviews are going to be online again, throwing in a few tips for working within that environment. I don't know, Simone, has there been any movement on the question of online or not? Because I know they were talking about it being online fairly recently, but I was hoping they were going to back off from that because it seems.
Ooh, Matt, you frozen.
Oh,
Last
sorry.
thing I heard was "it seems."
Oh, what I was going to say was it still seems as though Cambridge, at the very least, are planning on interviewing mostly online. But we're hopeful of there being some movement on that, right?
Yeah, I definitely would think so. I mean, at present, it seems like we're almost living in a normal world, free of those, COVID pandemic restrictions. And so I'm thinking possibly, definitely there will be changes in the interim. But, just I think prepare for all eventualities is probably the best thing to do.
Yeah, and if you're ready to do it online, then you'll almost certainly be perfectly good at doing it in person. But
Exactly.
I do think the online thing is a bit of a pity. It's a much nicer experience to go there, to see the place, to get a little bit of a feel for it.
Sure.
Whereas you'll have spent probably more than enough time on Zoom for your own preferences at this point. So let's hope that changed. But at the moment, the current plan is still online, which is a pity. So the interview itself, regardless of whether it's online or not, the shape of it is going to be fairly consistent. Although you will read online and in various books that the interviews can be quite madcap and varied, this is kind of an out-of-date way of looking at them. These days, they tend to be much more highly structured, much stricter. There's a lot of oversight and care that goes into making sure that the interview process is fair and equitable for everyone who applies. And so you don't get the kind of weird outliers that you might have heard stories about. There'll be 2, maybe even 3 people in the room with you during the interview. And that's to make sure that all of those people are generating discrete scores and all of that information is being centralized and continually audited throughout the day. It's quite an operation backstage, making sure that everyone is being properly assessed and that all those assessments are consistent. And the other thing to say is the kinds of questions you get. You've probably heard about, tell me about a banana, tell me what your favorite atom is, things like this. They may come up, but you're going to be dealing with problem-solving questions, which means that you're going to be working through a series of different related questions, not kind of random, difficult to answer, off-the-wall things. It's going to be quite structured because it's all about making sure that the people interviewing can see how it is you think and make sure that the kind of thinking that you're doing is the right kind for them. Now, if you are applying for Oxford particularly, you'll have at least 2 interviews, possibly a third one at another college. Cambridge, it can be a little bit different. They tend to shuffle people around a little bit less, but you'll certainly have at least 2 interviews, possibly 3 again. Depending on the subject you're applying for at Cambridge, there's a good chance there'll be a small test if you haven't done one in the October-November slot, just after the application deadline. And that's something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks' time in more detail. Each time you'll be interviewed by 2, probably 3 people. And that will range from some of the most senior academics at the college, right down to PhD students whose job it is there to sort of keep an eye on everyone and make sure everything's running smoothly. So it's not going to be a one-on-one thing. It might feel a little bit intimidated if you're talking to 3 people and there's just 1 of you. But the thing to bear in mind there is it's all about making sure that you get a really fair experience, so that there are plenty of people seeing what you're doing, that they can balance their opinions between them. It's not really 3-on-1, it's more like 1-on-3. It's them making sure that they're getting the maximum amount of information and insight out of you, and making sure all of that's really well measured. So don't think of it as them ganging up on you. It's, if anything, it's quite the reverse. They're intimidated by you, and so they've sent 3 people to deal with you. And the other thing to say is when you're in the interview, it is supposed to be difficult. If you come out of it feeling that you have done really badly, that it was too difficult, that you couldn't cope with it, that may be a good sign. It is unlikely that you are so good that you have absolutely smashed it and the whole thing felt really easy, because that would mean you would be in the top 5, maybe 10% of people who get in, which puts you in the top like 2% of people who applied. That's pretty unlikely. Much more likely is you're going to find that it was difficult, it was challenging, you felt stretched, and you come out of it not knowing if it went well or not. And that's good and healthy. So don't, you know, if the practice interviews you do with us, with your school, with anyone else, if they feel a little bit too easy, if you're building up too much confidence, you know, make sure you make them harder, because it's supposed to be hard. And the reason for that is they have a fairly clear set of things that they're looking for. This is helpfully for us a set of skills that are actually outlined by the university in some of their documentation, and we're sort of going to build up to that here. So the interview is about what we call soft skills. This is where you're thinking about how you build connections, whether that's with other people, whether that's between ideas. It's all about communication. This is an interview, after all. If you can do it on paper, that's great, but it's going to be a conversation and interaction. You're not going to know what they're going to say. You need to be able to adapt. You need to be able to understand the content of what they're saying, but also the tone, build up a kind of social relationship. These are all the kind of soft skill things that you want to be developing to prepare for the interview. And most importantly, you want to be thinking about what we call metacognition, not just thinking and coming up with good answers and processes, but making sure that the way that you are thinking through things, that you're presenting your ideas, that you know what you're doing so that you can explain it, so that you can present your ideas in a coherent way, and so that you can actually show you're working, so that even if you don't get to the perfect right answer, and in the interview, chances are there isn't going to be a perfect right answer, you can get credit for all of the steps you've taken along the way, and they can see all of the different pieces of thinking that you've put into it. So the way that the university thinks about this is it has, we're thinking about Oxford here specifically because it's where I got the information from. They break it down into 4 discrete categories that they'll be measuring your interview performance against. Oh no, this number is 3. 3 discrete categories. I told you it was too hot. Which they have as application, reasoning, and communication. So as you can read, they look at application being about your degree of engagement, your concentration, your enthusiasm. think of this as the kind of passion you've been trying to put through in the personal statement, particularly, showing that when you're faced with the kinds of problems that are typical of the subject you're applying to study, that you are really highly motivated to engage with them and to find answers. You know, doing an Oxbridge degree is hard work. You're going to be there, you know, working like a full-time job, more than a full-time job sometimes. And so having the enthusiasm and the passion to, you know, work 50 or 60 hours a week towards your degree is going to be really important. You know, this isn't like school where you might be starting at 9 and be done by 4. This is much more like a job, and you need to have that that degree of enthusiasm for it. Alongside that, you need to actually be able to do it, if that makes sense. Have the raw cognitive skills, be able to take in the new information, to put together arguments, to understand where your argument might go wrong, to properly weigh evidence. And if you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of something that doesn't work, that you're able to come back out and look again at what you've done dispassionately. One of the classic things that we hear about students in interviews, and that I was very, very much guilty of myself in my unsuccessful Oxford interview, which was 14 years ago. God. It's very easy to panic and to say something that you don't necessarily entirely believe, or that you don't have the evidence for. And then when you're questioned on it, is to go, no, definitely I'm right, and to start digging yourself into a hole of being certain that you know what you're talking about, when in reality you don't. And worst of all, you're sitting across from people who are much better informed, much smarter, much more knowledgeable than you are. One of the mistakes that people make in these interviews is they forget that they are there because they want to go to the university to learn, and they'll present themselves in a way that suggests they want to be at the university to teach. And this is a huge mistake. You want to be there curious and questioning. And if the people you're speaking to say, well, that doesn't seem like a good argument, or this is another piece of evidence that perhaps you haven't taken into account, you need to be able to break free of what you're arguing and try something else, because you don't want to try and outsmart them, essentially, because you're not going to succeed. And this all ties into communication again. You can have an incredible level of passion, you can have fantastic reasoning skills, but if you can't communicate that, if you can't get that from inside your head out there onto the table, then it's not going to serve you well at all. You need to be able to communicate in an effective, clear, interesting way that fosters engagement, because it's what the interview is all about. And this, particularly the communication skills, particularly given the situation with schooling for the past couple of years, these are the hardest part of the application skill set to develop. And that's why we're talking about them now in, June, rather than picking this up in the autumn, because preparing those skills, getting that practice in, is important to be doing now all the way through to the interview stage, because these aren't the kinds of skills you can pick up in a weekend. This is all about making sure that you have a really effective sort of setup, right in your mind for communicating with all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. It's a difficult set of skills, and so it's not something you can just develop quickly. It's something you need to practice day after day and over a long period of time to make sure that you're making all of those connections between neurons, or however it is the brain works. Now, that's all been a little bit abstract and high level. So I wanted to give a few examples of questions from the last couple of years from actual interviews. One question that was particularly popular a couple of years ago, we saw a couple of students had it, was asking about the ethics of violent protest. And this was a question that came up in the context of PPE, in the context of philosophy, but is also something that could be asked in the context of history as well. This was a slightly topical question a couple of years ago. I'm sure will be topical again. But these are the kinds of questions you can, you have to take care to make sure that you are addressing the question properly. The question here is ever be justified, not are they justified in a particular case? You're trying to deal with a big picture question. And it's also one of the areas where it can be very tempting to bring in your own politics, your own preferences and biases. And so it's always good practice not to do that. I find that sometimes arguing the opposite of your opinion from time to time can be a helpful way of getting the hang of what you actually believe. Another question in a similar vein about the legality of smoking. This is topical. There's been talk in recent weeks that the UK might implement a rule where the age at which you're allowed to start smoking would rise by 1 year every year, so that if you were under, I think, 16 now, it would never be legal for you to purchase cigarettes. What are the health why, looking at that proposed idea, why has smoking remained legal? What are the implications there? Why do other countries pursue different policies? Lots of interesting questions there. Again, thinking in a kind of political, historical, ethical, big picture sort of way. Thinking about chemistry, I've always liked this one because it's one of those things you might sort of not think of almost. What would you change about the periodic table, they ask. Now, I was never very good at chemistry, and so it never occurred to me that the periodic table could be different. It's a weird looking thing, right? It's not, if you were starting out as a design student, you probably wouldn't make it that way. But this question, it challenges you to demonstrate that you understand why it's made the way it is, how you might move it around, what implications that would have. Because, I'm not an expert here, but presumably they have tried out alternative layouts for the periodic table that haven't worked at various points in time. Maybe the reason it was set up the way it is no longer relevant. If you compare it, say, to the layout of a computer keyboard, which many of you will have in front of you, the reason the keys are laid out as they are on those is to make sure that the keys that you need to use one after another aren't too close together, because on a manual typewriter, they would get stuck. Now, that isn't a problem with computer keyboards, but we haven't changed the layout. So is it a situation like that? Is it something that's always been this way, and so we're not going to change it because it's always been this way? Who knows? I don't know anything about chemistry. And you'll also have questions of graph, data interpretation. They particularly love these for economics. I've got an economics one for you guys to have a look at. So this is a graph of something happening between 1950 and 2010. And so the question in this context will be to try and identify, first of all, what the graph is measuring. And as you were going through the interview discussion, the interviewer would share more and more information with you about the graph. So perhaps they would tell you that this is a graph of GDP, of gross domestic product, so the strength of a particular country's economy. So you might ask, for example, why this graph starts in 1950, and I expect that's so that you don't have to include the Second World War. If you've then figured out that these are different countries, you might try and figure out which different countries they are. You might try and guess based on your personal knowledge, and you might want to look at the different points at which things change. So we see here on this graph that the three colors we have here are very closely following a very similar pattern right up until 1975, when something very different happens to the darkest shade, and the remaining two continue to follow relatively similar patterns, eventually switching places before they really diverge in around 1992. So you might wonder, you might be interested in trying to pair these up with particular historical events, trying to figure out different theories. And then hopefully you would finally be told what they are, which is what I'm going to reveal, which are these are the GDP per capita of North Korea, South Korea, and China. And you would then be able to get into a discussion about the different political and economic and kind of global historical choices at work here. For example, I had no idea that South Korea and North Korea were roughly as rich as one another as recently as 1975. My dad was 15 then, and yet today, as we can see, people in South Korea are 10, 15, 20 times richer than those in North Korea. You know, how does a change like that happen in such a short period of time? How does why is it that the change in China is so much slower to get going, and even now isn't as steep as that which we see in South Korea? You know, we might even home in on something small like this little kink in the South Korean story around the year 2000. There are lots of different things you can do with these graph interpretation questions. And so if you are in a numerate subject, essentially anything that isn't just essays, practicing with blind graphs like this is a really good way to prepare yourself for the interview, because there are loads and loads of different kinds of typical graph that you can do that look that create interesting questions. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier on about my personal experiences, so I just wanted to touch on those briefly before I hand over to Simone to talk about the kind of support we're able to offer here at UniAdmissions in more detail. I bring these up as these are very much the mistakes I made. I'm very confident they're the mistakes that Simone would have stopped me making. First of these is to make sure that you have read everything on your personal statement. It can be very tempting to include a book that you've started or that you think will fit well with the other books that you're talking about and that you haven't actually read. You would be astonished at every level of academic life, whether it's at undergraduate, at postgraduate, in doctoral seminars. A surprising number of people won't have read the book. And I've also found that you will find that reading the book does make a surprising difference to how well you understand it, even more than watching the movie, crazy as it may sound. So do make sure you have read everything on your personal statement. Make sure that you're showing the depth of your knowledge at each point. It's really tempting to say that you know about 10 different things, but what you want to show is that you know about 3 things, and one of those things you know in incredible detail. If you can show real depth, that you've not just read 1 or 2 or 3 books, but that you've read the books that those refer to and the books that those refer to, and that all of a sudden you are, you know, 15 books and 7 different pieces, sort of theories and chains of analysis deep into that subject, that's what's going to show that you've got the passion and the application that we talked about earlier on. You don't want to know a little bit about the Romans and a little bit about the Greeks. You want to be in a position where you know almost everything there is to know about Caesar or whatever it may be, and that you can have a really detailed, in-depth, serious conversation with someone about that. You want to make sure you take your time, you stay calm. One thing I always suggest, and it seems really trivial, is if you're there in person, make sure you get one of these. If you're at home, make sure you've brought one with you. And I'm going to do it now. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask a question. It's a question I don't know the answer. There you go. Fully 10 seconds of secret thinking time while I drink some water. It's a really good little trick. It will help you calm down, and it does actually, and it will improve your cognition, your thinking skills, because all of a sudden you're not all focused on, I can't remember the answer, but all of a sudden you've had to turn on the bit of your brain that remembers how to drink, and it will help you calm down and feel more centered. If you don't turn on the bit of your brain that remembers how to drink, you will accidentally take the water into your lungs, and then you will cough and splutter, and that will also waste time. So either way, it goes well. And this leads into sort of the final 2 points, which are related. It is really tempting to make things up, to panic. Don't do it. They will know. You'll look silly. It'll make you feel silly. It won't work. So don't bullshit if you can avoid it. And if you do, apologize and row back on it. You know, it's a stressful situation. No one will be shocked if you've panicked. And the last one, which is kind of the mirror image of this, is remember why you're there. I do mock interviews with dozens of students over a year. And the kind of student who is the most frustrating is the one who I work with who is very clever, who is very able, who is really well prepared. But the way that they communicate their ideas is so aggressive, so it can be slightly patronizing. They have such certainty to them. it feels as though they're going to the university so that they can teach, so they can tell people what's what. And that's not the point. You're there to learn, to find things out, to ask questions. Make sure that's what you're emphasizing in the way you come across. Because if you give the impression that you are too smart to be there, then they will go, okay, well, you're too smart to be here. So that's fine. Someone else can come. Like, you're too good for us. That's fine. You don't want to be in that situation. And that sort of rounds down to the last point, which is sort of the last point of the interview. And you get there, almost certainly the last thing they will do at the end of the interview is they will ask if you have any questions. And there is an incredible temptation in this situation to ask a question that you already know the answer to, or a question that will make you look clever, or something like that. And I would just say the best questions are ones you actually want to know the answer to. So it may be that you're not going to get the chance to meet these people again. You may never spend time in this kind of academic setting. So go in with, in your pocket, 1 or 2 questions you really want to know the answer to. And if you've got a third one that comes up during the interview, go with that. But if you're going to meet the guy who is the #1 guy on something you're really interested in, you know, don't waste your opportunity to ask a question you actually want to know the answer to. It might not come up again. Now, the question I'm hoping that you're all asking is, what can you do to help beyond these slides? And that's where I'm going to hand over to Simone, who's going to talk about the kind of range of help we offer here at UniAdmissions.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yes. So my name is Simone and I'm a lead consultant here at UniAdmissions, and we offer programs of support to help you guys who are full of potential and academic promise, but who could really benefit from some structure and some support. And this is where, you know, we come in. So our programs generally outwork themselves through 4 ways. The first is one-to-one tuition. So we would team you up with somebody who has studied your subject and who has been to your first choice of university, and also who has achieved in the top 10% for their own admissions process. So this person is an expert and will be able to help and guide and navigate you through the relevant academic process in terms of your personal statement, any relevant admissions tests, and obviously the interviews, which is what we've been talking about in a lot of detail today. So you would have a number of one-to-one tutorials with this person, and after each tutorial you would actually get a report, and that's going to be sent to you, the student, and also to your parent or guardian, detailing what you've covered in the tutorial that day, and also any recommendations for homework. So it's a very kind of robust system. It ticks all of the boxes, but yeah, one-to-one tuition is a very important 25% of the program. The next thing also that we do is materials and resources. So we have something called a portal, and it's like the hub of all of our programs. It's where you, the students, meet with us. And on the portal, you'll have all of your materials or resources, your guides, your books, but very, very importantly, you'll have a theoretical academy attached to your admissions test. So for instance, if it was medicine, you would have a theoretical academy, a UCAT academy, and a BMAT academy. So this is a syllabus. It's a very structured syllabus where you get to learn, revise, and simulate. So you go through all of the contents, all of the specifications of the relevant tests, and eventually you would end up doing those past papers under timed constraints. That's really important. So a way of really measuring your progress and making sure that you are making the progress that is needful. Okay, so those 2 parts kind of go together, the tutorials and the materials and resources. We do something called weekly enrichment seminars. Now we've been talking about the interview process, and these are really key in helping you develop that soft skill that Matt was talking about. So it is a small group learning. So what we're doing is we're basically bridging the gap between where you guys are at A level and we're taking you up to university level. So these enrichment seminars are university level lectures. So it's a handful of students, a couple of expert tutors in the field, and every week you'll be discussing topics pertaining to your subject. This is going to give you that real in-depth focus that Matt was referring to that is needed. And it's going to help you obviously be more confident in your articulation around the subject, so that by the time you get to interview, a couple of things have happened. By that point, you would have relaxed because you would have known that you've been in these conversations, in these dialogues. So you'll feel more comfortable. You would have built up that muscle memory. But also, it will give you the opportunity to find out what you really enjoy about the subject. And because, you know, at A level, you're dealing with the nuts and bolts. So for instance, if it's medicine, it would be the chemistry and the biology. But with the enrichment seminars, you're talking about the things that underpin the subject, like morals and ethics or NHS structure, things that you are not going to cover in your A-level syllabus. So this really begins to highlight to you what you enjoy about the subject, but it also begins to really elevate you above the cohort, and you'll begin to just naturally stand out. All of that is going to come out in your interview process. Okay, and finally, we do something called intensive courses. Now, intensive courses are really important because they're like a marker, a check for both us and yourselves to make sure that before you actually do the actual deadline, so whether that's the personal statement submission, the UCAT, the BMAT, or the interviews, to make sure that you are ready for that deadline. So 2 weeks before the deadline, we put you on one of these intensive courses and we put you through your paces. It is intense, that's the way that it's designed, but what it should do is it should help you to know that you are ready. If you aren't ready for whatever reason, we have a 2-week window in which to fill any gaps and to really increase your learning and your understanding so that you are ready by the deadline. So again, just taking out all of that risk, making sure that your preparation is robust and that it's strong and that you know that you've done enough so that when you go into the real life deadline, you're totally ready to be successful. So the programs are very, very comprehensive. You know, they do take a lot of time and investment, but the payoff is visible for all to see. And just before I hand back over to Matt, it's kind of my responsibility to make sure that we're choosing the right type of student, because we are a fully selective prep school, and it's important that, you know, you've got the right attitude as well as the right academic profile.
Absolutely. Thanks, Simone. As Simone has talked about there, the good news is that it all does seem to work. We're really proud of the rates of success we've had over the past several years. Our success at Oxford is still above 60%, which is something we're incredibly pleased with. I think with any luck, we'll be closing on our 500th offer sometime in the new year if things all go to plan this cycle. And we're also really proud of our success in medicine, which is still really, really impressive and is something that we're super proud of. It all seems to compare pretty favourably with Oxford. With Oxford? No, at Oxford with the even some of the most expensive schools in the country. So while we are, I would say, a little bit cheaper than Eton, we don't have such fun outfits. So, you know, you've got to make a choice there. None of the funny hats, but definitely cheaper and more successful, which is really important. As Simone was talking about earlier, we are selective, but that isn't selection based purely on academics. We care just as much, if not more, about the kind of attitude you bring to the table. As I talked about earlier, the attitude that you come into the interview with is incredibly important, and the way in which you approach the work that we do with you, really committing to it in a serious way, is really important to us as well. Our experience is that students who have absolutely sailed through their GCSEs, who are a little bit complacent, tend not to do as well in the university application process as those who have had to work hard for it. And so we find that we would much rather work with a student who is really highly motivated and is starting from A's rather than A stars, than a student who has never really put any effort into getting an A star in their life. And incredible as it may seem, they do exist. We find that those students are in fact harder to work with. And so we would much rather have students who have the right attitude than students who are already absolutely nailing all of the grades. The other thing that we really like is for you to say something nice about us on Trustpilot. You can read their various reviews from customers we've worked with, mostly happy, some unhappy. But the nice thing there is they are all, fully independent, outside voices. And so that will give you something to put alongside what we've talked about here today to around do. If you'd like to say something nice about me, about Simone, about these webinars in that one of those reviews, that would be lovely. I would very much appreciate it. And I would probably switch out these reviews, which we're getting a little old now, January. In fact, we'll use it as an incentive, shall we? If someone says puts in a nice review about me on Trustpilot, I'll put it here on this slide of the presentation and all the presentations going forward. What a prize. The other thing I recommend is to tune in for my colleague Will and our founder Rohan's podcast. I had been planned to be taking part in this podcast on Monday, but unfortunately I'm moving house. So everything where I live is an enormous mess, which unfortunately is not conducive to participating in the podcast, but I was very flattered to be invited. It's only taken them a year, and so I can now finally wholeheartedly endorse the podcast, whereas previously I thought it was terrible and wrong and biased against me. So I hated it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take some questions. So please drop them into the Q&A section, which should be somewhere on your screen. You can drop them into the chat as well, but the format of it is nicer in the Q&A section. And we will answer as many of those as we can as we push on through to, we'll probably finish a little before 3 o'clock, I expect, depending on questions. So while you're putting those in, I would also suggest, if you have enjoyed what we've had to say today, if you have found it useful, if you are interested in coming to work with us as an organization, the first thing to do is to book in a consultation. This is a phone call with Simone or one of her colleagues. We're open 7 days a week, and that gives you the chance to talk through your particular needs, your particular aspirations, and for us to figure out what kind of collaboration between us would be right. It may be that we're not right for you. It may not be that you're not right for us. Everything that we have in that consultation, it's completely fee-free, commitment-free. It's about making sure there's a good match between us and there's something that we can do to help. We don't work with everyone, and that's choice on both sides. And so there's no commitment at this stage. It's really just to understand what you're hoping to achieve. And the thing here as well is it gives us a chance to really talk about you, about your needs, which is something that's very hard to do in this webinar format, because we then end up speaking to one person at a time when there are an awful lot of people here. So if you have questions that are fairly personal, fairly specific, then you'll be much better off going into the consultation rather than asking us here, although we will try to answer every question. It also gives Simone the chance to send me an email with any questions she has about data, so I can look things up as well, which is always nice. So we will start off with Jaspreet asks about the kinds of graphs that might be included in a medicine interview at Oxford. So these are inevitably going to be medical graphs. So I imagine these might be to do with things like the levels of particular chemicals or hormones in the blood. So you might be given a set of diagnostic charts for a patient who has a particular kind of problem, and then you would work through in a diagnostic style manner with the interviewer what the problem might be, but as you get more information, try and test out various hypotheses. So if you were looking at, say, this is where it gets interesting because I'm of course not a doctor. If you were looking at a patient who's experiencing, say, a hypoglycemic episode, you might be given the graph showing that, and then work your way through the problem, figuring out different aspects of it, so that you can figure out a diagnosis, try and figure out a cause, things like that. As I say, not being a doctor, I hope that was a good enough answer. We'll see. I'm sure we'll see. And we've had a question about the graduate medicine entry course in Oxford. Have we had, I'm trying to think, we've had a couple of grad med entries recently. Am I right in remembering that, Simone?
Yes, more people are coming through for, different levels of, academia, which is always good. So we'll always try and find a way to help every student.
Yeah. And I know that we've had some success over the years with graduate entry at Oxford. It's also worth bearing in mind here that there is graduate entry medicine at Cambridge as well, and there are, on the whole, more places there. So I do recommend considering both when you're going to apply, as I believe, I'm not certain, but I think with graduate entry, you have a little bit more flexibility about whether you apply to both, but that's something I would have to double check. There we are. We have a question about changes to the UCAT as well. So for those of you who are applying for medicine, this is probably quite relevant. The format of the UCAT has subtly changed in the last few weeks. So essentially the number of questions has gone down ever so slightly in the first two sections. But the amount of time to answer those questions has gone down as well. So there is no real change in the timings for the abstract reasoning and the quantitative reasoning. So that's all sort of changed. The real change is that there are now fewer situational judgment questions, but there is a new type of question, which is more associated with importance. Now, the real details of this, we have an article up on our website already, which I'm just going to pop into the chat for everyone, outlining what's going on. But we are still working out the exact implications of this. But the changes are relatively small. Changes like this aren't unusual. They changed the number of questions in the BMAT a couple of years ago on along similar lines, and so I wouldn't say that any preparation you've done so far has been wasted. It will just be a little bit of tweaking of the test based on any number of factors on the side of the UCAT consortium. From what I've read, they haven't released a particular explanation for the changes yet, and so that's something to watch out for if there is a rationale that is forthcoming. But I wouldn't hold my breath. It may well be that they just don't explain. Osha asks about applying from the States to Oxford. Yep, that's absolutely fine. You won't be the first American at Cambridge. There are, in fact, loads and loads. And so applying from the US with different qualifications is absolutely fine. It's worth double checking that the exact exams you're doing are the ones they're expecting, but I wouldn't imagine there'll be a great deal of difficulty coming across to America. If you were coming across from Saudi Arabia or from Eswatini, there might be bigger problems, but coming across from the States shouldn't be a problem at all. And Oxford and Cambridge, particularly at the graduate level, are absolutely stuffed with Americans, so you will feel very, very much at home. Now we have a question about computer science interview questions. Now, I don't know anything about computer science, and I'm terrible at abstract algebra. So that is a question that I'm going to have to pass on. But if you want to get in touch with us directly, Dr. Bhattacharya, I will try and find an answer for you, because I know we do have some sample questions. There should be some in our interview books. There will be some in our maths entry test admissions prep. But unfortunately, because I don't understand the material, it's very difficult for me to make one up on the spot. But we definitely do have some kind of documentation that we can share with you if we have a more direct conversation. I appreciate that may not be the most satisfying answer. Mina asks about the success rate for engineering undergraduates. This is one I would have to look up. Let me think. I believe engineering at Cambridge, because it's not, I say they do it in both places, don't they, engineering?
Yeah.
So this is a great example of something I would have to look up, because unfortunately, I can't run the PowerPoint presentation and Microsoft Excel at the same time, because the PowerPoint presentation disappears and there's a big Excel chart. This is another one. Please do get in touch and we will figure it out. I definitely have the answer, but unfortunately I can't get to it because of the limits of technology, which I appreciate is a little frustrating. Anosha clarifies that they are applying from the UAE. Yeah, that shouldn't be fine. Shouldn't be a problem. As long as you're doing the standard American set of exams, I don't think that's likely to be an obstacle at all. In fact, I'm just pulling up the relevant resource list, but it says yeah, Oxford and Cambridge are both absolutely happy with the American exam system. So I will send over to you, in fact, in a little link, the relevant information from Oxford for you to have a look at. But as I say, as long as you're applying, the vast majority of Western education systems, it doesn't pose a problem. It just tends to be places where the university isn't confident that the level of equivalence between the exam systems is sufficient. And in those instances, a lot of students will just do A-levels and fix that problem there. Rula asked about language skill tests for English eligibility. Yeah, generally speaking, if you are speaking English for your as the main language in your secondary education, you get to skip over doing the IELTS. It's just something to chase up with the university when you come to apply. There's a slim chance they might get you to do the IELTS, but the good news is you'll probably find it very easy. I've never done the IELTS. Maybe it will be fun. Maybe I should give it a go. It's been a long time since I got a really good score on an exam. Athbar asks about whether Oxford prefer A-levels or APs. If you're applying from outside, the important thing is where you're applying from. So if you're applying from outside of the UK, then it really doesn't matter what exam system you followed. As long as Oxford recognises them, they're all fine. And if you're inside the UK, again, it isn't a huge problem whether you're doing the A-levels, the Scottish Highers, the Irish Leaving Cert. They won't be picking based on the exam system they're doing. They'll just be trying to, they'll be picking based on who's the best, basically. And so all you can do is score highly in your exams, but I wouldn't worry about which set you're taking. That's unlikely to be an important factor. Saloni asks about getting support for both the UCAT and the BMAT. Absolutely. Anyone who's applying for medicine, we always encourage them to do both. They're quite different exams, but they are sat at different times and they apply for different universities. So we always encourage people to do a mix of UCAT and BMAT applications, and we provide full support for both. So do get in touch with support with either or indeed both of those, particularly the UCAT, because I know that is closing in all of a sudden. Simon asks about, or I'll come back to Simon's question actually, because that's an interesting one. Sally asks about how long after the interview do you hear if you are successful or not? Now, my recollection is that in fact, because it's a long time since this happened to me. Simone, can you remember what the timings are like at the moment for responses?
Yeah, for Oxford and Cambridge, usually you hear by the end of January. So obviously that will happen usually the middle of December. And then you would be notified by kind of late January about that. And for other universities who usually have the interviews, say, beginning of January to the beginning of April, the cutoff point usually is about the 19th of May. If you've not heard anything by that point, the likelihood is that you won't, and unfortunately you've been unsuccessful.
Thanks, Simone. As Simone says, with Oxford and Cambridge, generally speaking, the interviews will be before Christmas, and you'll get an answer a couple of weeks after the end of the Christmas holidays. In the olden days, you did used to sometimes hear before Christmas, but I think that process has slowed down a little bit, not least because I think they're letting the academics have more time off over Christmas, which can only be a good thing. AFBA asks about the weight of school grades and admissions tests and things like that. This is something that we are going to be talking about in inordinate detail in upcoming sessions. We have a lot of graphs. Oh, so many graphs. So rather than spoil that now, I would suggest that you join us in a couple of weeks' time when we will be talking about that sort of thing in unbelievable depth. So keep an eye on the schedule of webinars. But yes, I have spent hundreds of hours breaking down the relative importance of different components of the application. So you will find out far too much in an upcoming week. And it's something we will have talked about in the past as well. So if you go through the archive, there are, I would imagine, 3 or 4 hours of me talking about that if you would like to. And I can't imagine anyone would like to watch those. Not what I'll be watching this evening. Let's put it that way. Not old recordings of myself. I've never put them on for my wife, actually. Perhaps I should do that as a kind of holy torture. And I wanted to answer finally, just so that we can wrap up before 3 o'clock, this question from Simon. So he asks about the open application. So the open application is a really fascinating thing, at least for me, probably not for normal people. From the data we have, particularly from Oxford for it, students who apply to Oxford will get a place roughly 18–19% of the time, unless they make an opening application, in which case they get in substantially less of the time. I'm just going to double check the numbers while I've got you here. And it is just an enormous mystery. I have yet to find out, and I've asked a lot of people, including people who work on the admissions process at Oxford specifically, but open applications are simply not as successful as those that pick a college. And it is entirely unclear why. My best guess at the moment is that because students who make open applications tend to have done less preparation towards their application, that as a consequence they are on the whole less successful because they haven't planned all that far ahead. It is a bit of a mystery though, because it sort of defines statistics. So I've got the numbers up here now. So 83% of applicants apply to a college, and the remaining 17% make an open application. Now you would think, all things being equal, that then 83% of the offers would go to people who pick a college, and 17% would go to those who make an open application. No, not at all. 93% of the offers go to people who make a specific college application, and only 7% of the offers go to people who make an open application. Now, that is an enormous difference, and I've never been able to figure out why. As I say, my only guess is that people who are applying last minute, who haven't put an enormous amount of thought and effort and time into the application, who are doing it kind of on a whim. If you can imagine yourself filling out the UCAS form at the last possible minute, and it asks you which college you want to apply for, and you have no idea, you haven't thought about this question at all, and it gives you the option to not pick, that's probably what you do. And that accounts for why people who make open applications are so much less successful. It is a huge mystery because it doesn't, I'm not entirely convinced by that story. I don't think it can account for such a large effect size. So what I would say is, when you make an open application, your application is assigned to a college almost at random, based on which colleges have been less popular that year. I would just pick one at random. If you don't know, just pick one. Pick one, think of an arbitrary choosing system and use that. Pick the one that has that will go best with your name. So Simon, let's have a look at the list of Oxford colleges. Which name would go best with Simon? So you could go to, yeah, you could go to Somerville, then you could be Somerville Simon. Go with that. Like, just come up with something, because we don't know why, but for some reason, open applications are less successful. So I would say employ a similar amount of logic and seriousness to just picking one at random, because that's all the open application process will do anyway. And you may as well have it on your side. You know, pick one which is near the shops, near the train station. Pick one that you like the look of. Just come up with some kind of logic to it, because for some reason we've not been able to figure out open applications are a bad idea. So don't make one. Just pick a college based on some kind of arbitrary piece of information. I appreciate that's not very data driven, but there you go. I think on that note, we'll call it a day here. Thank you so much for joining me, Simone. It has been lovely to see you again.
Likewise, thank you.
Feel much better and cooler in a few minutes' time.
I'm sure I will.
And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been lovely to see all of your virtual smiling faces. And we'll be back next week when we'll be talking about the opportunities outside of academia that have existed at Oxbridge. Things like rugby and cricket and comedy and all sorts of things like that. All the things that you can do instead of your degree. And then the lecturers will tell you off for being distracted by them. So thank you very much and have a lovely weekend, everyone. Goodbye.